Welcome to our open source startup podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Robbie from Cowboy Ventures, and I'm joined as always with my awesome co-host, Tim Chen of Essence VC. And today we're super excited to have a conversation with Shanea Leven, who is founder and CEO of CodeSee. And I've had the chance actually to meet her in person, which is very rare, I think, for any connections made over the last couple of years. She's wonderful, and we're really excited to have her on.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to get a chance to chat with you both.
Awesome. So where we always like to start is going back to the beginning and giving us kind of the founding story of where the idea for CodeSee came from.
Yeah. So the idea came from my pain at Docker. I've been in dev tools for 10 years or so. And the same problem kept happening over and over again. But like the most visceral reaction happened to me when we were working on a feature, and me and the team were working on this thing for several months, right before, and we were ready to launch it. And 2 days before, there was a bug. And basically, there was, long story short, there's nobody left at Docker to know how that part of the code base worked so that we could fix the bug. And basically, we would have to have read the code line by line for like a month in order to make sure that we didn't cause like a catastrophic downstream like problem to something else. And so that thing didn't get out the door. It did not get launched. And it was a lot of obscenities were yelled, and there were just, it was really hard because it was something that users really needed. And so, I think afterwards I just thought to myself, like, how is this happening again? Like, why do we not understand our code? And out of that, a lot of iteration, a lot of testing, and CodeSee was kind of born out of that idea.
That's super awesome. And so love to learn more about this idea of understanding your code, because I think there are other products that have been talking about understanding your code, help you actually understand the context. And we have seen other code that does searching better, but I think your idea of understanding is definitely a lot different. Actually, we don't see a lot of visualizations doing it, right? So
Totally.
that seems quite new. May you talk about, is there any iterations you went through, and what ended up to what your product does? If you talk about what your product actually does, will be helpful too.
Sure. So the CodeSee is essentially, you can think about it as a Google map for your whole code workflow. So if you think about it, if you take a step back, our engineering inherently is all visual. We read the code line by line, and because we don't have a UI, we make that visualization in our heads. We visualize it in all of our various ways. Some people do it geographically. Some people visualize it as a system, and then data kind of transflowing through that system. Some people do it in various different ways. Some people take notes and do it in charts, right? So it's all inherently visual. But we haven't actually been able to visualize how code works on a screen yet. And yes, we have, previous iterations of this, like UML diagrams and, architecture diagram sort of things. But the previous iterations, those also have tremendous problems, right? And so, as time has gone on, our code bases have become ever so complex, just so complex, right? Like over the last 10 years, the code base landscape has just exploded. And so the amount of code that we need to visualize or understand at any given point is too much for any one person to understand if the code base gets over a certain size. And so taking all of those ideas, the fastest way to understand code is to create a picture of it, right? That's where whiteboards came from. You just, draw everything out on a whiteboard and you move on, right? Because that is inherently the fastest way. So CodeSee is a really souped up version of that whiteboard diagram. And it that whiteboard, imagine it follows you throughout your code, like your development workflow. So not just when you're sketching out at the beginning. Yes, we do that too. But when you're writing the code, you want to take that visualization into your editor. When you want to review the code with somebody else, when you're doing a code review, you want to take all of that visualization in that context and hand it over to your teammate. And then you want to be able to visually automate that when you've got all of that feedback locked and loaded, ready to go. So we really bring that visualization throughout your code development process. And the previous question was like, how did we get those things together? Like, what was the iteration? It was our code bases are very, like, there's a lot of questions that you need to answer when it comes to understanding your code, an endless amount. And they can happen at any level of the code base. So sometimes, your question is at the services layer. Sometimes it's at the code layer or this directory, this package layer. Sometimes it's with an external dependency, right? Sometimes it's with the data isn't being transformed correctly. And so we're working on building a visualization that can answer any question that you have at any layer. But you can't build all of that in a day or two. So our iterations are, first you build the middle layer, you kind of have a solid foundation all the way through, and then you can layer things on top of it and make sure that they intermingle. And we're still haven't even scratched the surface yet, but I definitely think we're on our way.
It's awesome. And I love the vision for CodeSee, trying to give companies and teams the ability to understand their code. I'm curious though, because most of our audience are founders or project owners that want to start a company. And where did you start? Because you talked about a lot of really interesting applications around code reviews and onboarding, but I imagine early on it was really maybe keying in on one use case and trying to find a nice entry point and then broaden out to a bunch of others. But would love to just understand where you started.
Yeah, we started, excuse me, with onboarding to a new code base. And the reason we started there was because every developer, if you're not starting from a hello world application, you're going to need to go in and understand a little bit about that code base before you can modify it. And so onboarding, whether it's a new code base altogether, or even you've switched teams or you've never seen that part of the code base before, how do you glean enough information to get you started so you can answer the question, where did I start? Where do I start? How did that work? Like, where do I go next? What do I know? What do I don't know that I need to now go figure out, right? And then that kind of starts your process. So we call that the explore or the prep stage. And it gets up until the point where how do you know you understand your code is you can actually make a plan now to modify it. And that's how you know that you have understood something. So that's where we started.
One thing that stood up for us, obviously, and while we were having the conversation, is your open source focus here. And so you have a really interesting community. I realize there's actually so many things going on. There's a Discord channel, there's posts, Tell us, what is this open source side of things? Part of CodeSee, and what is your thought process and how you even started?
Absolutely. So we started with open source. It is very near and dear to my heart. So as I mentioned before, every developer has to onboard to a new code base, including an open source repo, right? And so in order to help people move forward in their open source contribution, we thought, what if we could help make it easier for maintainers and project owners to help contributors help get some of that help that they desperately need? And there's a lot of resources out there, but once you're done reading it all, and once you've found an issue, you still end up at the same place. It's like, how do I actually understand this code so I can modify it, right? And you end up at the same place as any other code base. And there were no tools for helping the maintainer onboard new contributors and making that understanding this massive code base easier. And so we really wanted to contribute back to the open source community this really particular skill that we can uniquely solve, as opposed to only sponsoring open source projects, which every open source project needs sponsorship. But like this particular thing to actually get the help that they need, we figured was like we could lower that barrier to entry. We could really help all of the open source projects.
And I'm super curious on the open source project side of the business. Did you start with certain projects and then try to figure out who you could work with on the customer side who is using those projects? Or was it the flip side where you let your early users or customers tell you what to cover?
The latter. So we invited a bunch of people to this. At the time, it was called OSS Port, but we rebranded to calling it Open Source Hub, which now has more, like Tim said, more things, the Discord community and all things open source. We've got a growing newsletter, depending on which platform, it's like 10,000 people at this point. We really started with just inviting open source maintainers at Hacktoberfest, right? That's where you're going to start to onboard in theory, a huge amount of contributors. And a lot of maintainers are doing this in their spare time. They might not have thought about how do I create a great developer experience for a new contributor, right? And so we've barely figured that out in the company side, right? So CodeSee was, we really wanted to provide that service for free to open source maintainers.
So it sounds like you are curating open source projects, right? You allow people to list their open source projects and give them the place to highlight them. So we talk a little about that, because I think that seems unique. We're also are basically creating not just a way to use all the open source projects, which is your free plan. Because I just tried it today. It's awesome. But this whole open source community and curation, what is the thought process around that?
Yeah. So we thought that we wanted to really provide a community for onboarding to the open source repo when we started, but it's since blossomed, right? So what do you really need to onboard contributors to a project? You need the project, you need the maintainer, you need some tooling, but you also need contributors, right? And so we thought that if we provided a place that the maintainer could, talk about not only their project, talk about the impact of their projects, highlight some things that don't necessarily get highlighted all the time, like, if this is a social activism project, or if this is a, climate change project, really bringing contributors over into the community. We have this place to talk about open source. So we really wanted to provide that marketplace style community that both the maintainers and the contributors can really find value. And in the latest update, we've also made this really awesome contributor workflow. So whenever you contribute to one of the open source projects on Open Source Hub, we also visualize the contributors' change in the context of the rest of the code base. And that allows for a contributor to share how they did the change, why they did it, what impact that change had on that project. And they're able to really share all of that wisdom with the rest of the community. And that's all kind of built on top of our product. Any developer can do that, right? So we really wanted to provide a place to show all of that off.
It's such a unique way to use a lot of the core tenets of an open source strategy. I think it's super interesting. I wanted to shift focus a little bit to talk about messaging, because I think it's something that you and the team have done a particularly good job on, and it's one of the hardest things for technical founders to figure out.
We hope.
You talk about things like continuous understanding, having a GPS for your code base. What's your process for figuring out what messaging will land, and when it's landed, not to iterate on it more, because it is a little bit, to what Tim alluded to earlier, a bit of a confusing space where there's so many applications for understanding your code base. So trying to own the messaging is super valuable. So what's your process, and like, what have you learned?
I think my process involves a lot of writing and a lot of crying and a lot of talking to people face to face. So you can really, like, it's really hard. I don't know, for me, I'm not a natural writer. I'm not a natural, like I think if I talk about CodeSee, I do a demo or whatever and show people how it works, like they're like, oh, I get it. Right. But when it comes to just like being behind a screen and like those sorts of things, like it's really hard to get that feedback. So I don't even know if I've stopped iterating yet. Like I think that we have a message, and oftentimes I'll take it to an event and I'll try to say those messages. And if someone's eyes start to glaze over, and you have to really see and understand like how developers work. Like sometimes eyes will glaze over is very different than them being like just thinking about it, right? Like we're all just might be thinking about it and we're not like, oh my God, that's the most exciting idea, but that doesn't mean they're not still excited. So like really understanding, my peers, right? And how people interact when you start to say messages out loud. And then I think doing the normal like startup testing, right? Like doing and Google Ads, and we had like 5 different messages that we tossed some things at, and we see what converted the best, and kind of went with that, the normal startup stuff. Yeah. There's this book. I feel like a lot of people know about it. The book Traction with the Bullseye, and that one. Follow it. We do what everyone else does.
Yeah, but I think every space has their own unique challenges. I think definitely thinking about open source community, and I think there's definitely a lot of value when it comes to helping visualize code bases, open source projects, and because I've been working on a lot of open source projects myself for a while, mm-hmm. and we all have to hand write these stuff, especially for newer players, people who have learned diagram, ASCII code. You ask engineer to draw diagrams, end up becoming some visual thing. But I think there's also another part of it is engineers tend to want to add their own flavor or taste or things they want to do on a diagram, right? So there's some kind of trade-off here, I feel like, because you're auto-generating these, and I'm sure you can add a lot more other information on top of that. But right now, looking at these, there's the relationship between what calls what, right? There's so much information to potentially visualize.
Yep.
What is the thought process around the sort of ease of use? You can just give you a PR, give you a repo, here's a map, versus I also want to annotate something into a particular visualization. And is CodeSee, do you start off from generating it first, or do we add engineers to be able to do more on top? Or what do you have to see the evolution of a product from your user starting to end?
Yeah, so we do that already today. So as I mentioned, it goes back to that layered like thought process of a code base where we go back and forth with this actually all the time. But today the product works when people kind of say, oh, it's a Google map of your code base, and you sign up for the product and you connect your repo. They expect to see a map immediately, right? So we give them that map. They get a little bit overwhelmed because people aren't really used to seeing their code automatically visualized, right? They have this picture in their heads of how they think it looks. But I have this saying that, don't worry, everyone has their own plate of spaghetti. Like it's all spaghetti code. Everyone just looks a little bit different. And then you can annotate it any way that you want today. And as what we recommend is like, you take one concept on a map. Your code is always there. You can just like collapse the rest of the code that isn't relevant for that particular view. And so the developer, future developers, or your future teammates or yourself won't get confused if you've got too many concepts going in a map, because you want to make it very clean and crisp. And as the underlying code changes, all of the annotations on top of that will persist. So you only have to do it once, essentially.
I'm curious because you are, and your pricing plan operates this way, but also you just are very much like in touch with seeing how developers will kind of collaborate with each other. And there's been this big movement towards like collaborative coding and like kind of real-time Figma like terminals and like code editors.
Yeah.
Have you seen that developers actually do like that collaborative aspect and care a lot about it, or that they do, and maybe this is a little bit to Tim's question too, they kind of want their own view, annotations, notes on things?
Yeah.
Like, what's just your perception of that?
I think it depends. It's the typical engineering answer with it depends. I think that at first, when people are trying out a new tool, they want their own version of it and they kind of want to play with it themselves. But then when they've got it to a point where two things happen, either it looks good or they have a question, they need that real-time feedback, because in the previous world, like we're all holding all of the things in our heads, right? And so whenever you need to get that information out of someone's head is where you really need that collaborative aspect of things. And so I just, our product works where you can enable both are possible. Like maps start off by default and as default private, and then you can share them later. But like it really just depends on what you're working on and how it's all connected.
So I'm curious about maybe the way you run the company, because obviously the Discord, I'm part of looking at it. You do need to run it. There's actually a moderation aspects of it. So
yeah,
I can see the open source community, the curation, right? You can ask people to add a PR, right? And you can also help them promote it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual community always needs active work.
Yes.
And how do you really see this community work with your product? Because when I'm looking at it, there's definitely, it's open source hub as generally, right? There's no code specific discussion, a little bit, but there's gaming, there's Web3 NFTs, right? There's all kinds of things. Which I like. I think it's better to have a general wide open community for people to actually be part of.
Yeah.
But then how do you sort of prioritize the investments you make into this kind of community? Do you have other people in the community also running with you? I was curious, how do you run a community? Because there's a fixed amount of cost there versus the rest of the company.
Yeah. So we, as I mentioned, like we are open source is that's where we started, right? We started visualizing open source repos. So we have a head of community. Her name's Anna. She's absolutely incredible at building and running and having the day-to-day, but also the long-term vision of how you grow and support an active community. And that is something that, again, even if our product fails tomorrow, we have a group of people that will give us feedback, that will help us iterate, and that hopefully we'll be able to provide them some value, right? And we see that as you get developers really excited about something, and they get really excited, and we can all help each other out, because most everyone at the company today is a developer, right? So like we're all like building something that we want to use, but also hopefully our peers want to use, and our friends.
So you do also have, though, a VP of design and someone in customer success right now, which I think is awesome, because I think for functions, when you have a technical founder, oftentimes functions outside of engineering take longer than maybe they should in some cases to hire. And so what have you kind of learned about team building, and what maybe one or two really game-changing hires that you've learned and you would advise other founders to consider early?
Yeah. I have a lot. We would need another whole podcast for team building, but I've been in a lot of startups. I've been in a lot of companies. I look very young, but I've been in a lot of companies, and I have very, very strong opinions on how you build a team, how you build culture, how you build, what are all the ways that you need to work with the team? What are the core values of the team that I want to build for the whole company? And so I think that I've heard two models that were successful, and every founder has to figure out like what works best for them, which is like hire smart people and build the culture together. Or, if you have a vision of what you want the culture to represent, then go and put those in place, which is the way that I did it. But what not to do is you just never think about culture at all. And that you don't want to do that because then it will kind of, start to snowball and grow, and then you have no control over it. And then you have to walk it back. Right. So really thinking about culture and team building as its own product, right? Thinking about culture as a living, breathing thing that you reward. You reward the behaviors that you want to see, and you not punish, but like talk through the behaviors that you don't want to see. And you have those foundations in place. And that really does start with the leadership team. It has to be a concerted effort. So it's just a day-to-day occurrence of respecting each other's humanity. I think today I went into a meeting being like, y'all, I'm in a mood today. I apologize in advance. I didn't particularly sleep really well, and I had a 6 a.m. sales call, and I'm dying. I'm like literally falling asleep in my chair. So, it really having, and everyone's like, yeah, okay, cool, no problem, right? But being able to have those conversations where everyone knows that I'm a human and I know that they're humans, and we're all trying to be better humans. That makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Yeah, being a founder is hard.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, I was one myself, and it definitely gets pretty difficult. And so, what is the biggest lessons or challenges you had to overcome this whole time? Because I think there are many things, as we all know, but what is like, okay, that one seems really hard, or a few things that were really hard, and we had to really go overcome it. And it could be even fundraising or anything like that. But tell me, what are the things you learned the most?
I think, I have a lot of founder friends, and we talk about this often. I think particularly as a founder, if there's a particular thing in your personality that, you think that you should work on, or like you've kind of like neglected over the years, it's going to come out as a founder and you're going to have to face it no matter what. And it being a founder really tests you and all of your limits. You really need all of those things moving forward. And I think for myself, I think that was the hardest lesson. And, testing all of those things and having it be okay to not be perfect. And hopefully we built a team that if I mess up, people will forgive me. And the company won't come crashing down because I made a mistake. You hold a lot of the responsibility on your shoulders. And I think kind of grappling with that day to day and being responsible for not only your team members, but your users and your investors and like those sorts of things. It can take a toll if you really don't like self-reflect and take care of yourself and give yourself a little bit of grace. As I say this I'm still working on it.
Awesome. And I also wanted to talk a bit about your process for pricing and how you've thought about that, just because it tends to be something that a lot of founders find quite difficult to figure out early on. So were there other companies that you tried to model after, or different kind of elements that I'm sure maybe part of it is still that it's an iterative process. Pricing is something that's always in motion. But what are some of your learnings that you think would be helpful for other founders?
Yeah, I think so. Definite was an iteration. We had a beta program before we did the formal announcement, and so we were able to test some things before we kind of did a whole big thing, and then we just decided. There were a lot of conversations back and forth, but I think the best thing that we did was pick something and then iterate from there. I think we have some new hypotheses that we want to be able to implement. But I think what I didn't anticipate when we picked our pricing strategy was the market and the change in the market, right? And so we decided to keep our prices like what we think is reasonable. Because we want people to be able to feel like they can get this level of visibility without having to feel like they can't afford it. And so that's kind of our thinking, at least currently. And we hope that people kind of, support all of the work that, our team, our community is doing, because code visibility it's basically the new observability, right? Like we all really need and deserve code visibility. We need to make our lives a little bit easier.
I like that. That's a really good analogy. You also have some really awesome logos from users of CodeSee on your site. So Sneak, Salesforce Discovery. I'm curious if there were one or two user or customer conversations that really stand out, where it was kind of like an aha moment of, oh, we're really onto something, or, oh, okay, that's really going to help define our product features or something. Because I think like those early aha moments around go to market and just like starting to feel product market fit are super interesting and helpful to folks who haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah. I actually think that we have some of our earliest users were, like we said, big open source repos. One of my favorites to talk about, because they're just doing so awesome and what they're doing is so hard and unique, is Distribute Aid. They are a nonprofit organization that does exactly what their title says. They distribute aid, but the shipments that they track, and the website and all of their APIs are all open source. So Taylor is one of the co-founders who essentially is shipping millions of dollars of aid all over the world based on an open source project and volunteer developers. And we've been helping them for years really onboard and support volunteer contributors to make their refugee aid possible. And so we get a lot of feedback we've gotten a lot of feedback over the years. And one of the earliest ones was just, how do we make this team more efficient when people are kind of coming in and out? And if you can get tools helpful for people who are coming in and out of the code base basically every week, like you can make a team like experience better who's like not coming in and out for a couple years, right? And so that was really, that most extreme case. And then we were able to walk that back and really fill in the gaps for the middle.
So I think you already touched on this, which, you talk about your own, the biggest challenge you have to face, which is that you really have to look at and handle one of the challenges you should be aware of?
Don't wait to do go to market. In the very early days when it was just Josh and I, my co-founder, it was basically like we were in stealth at first. You can always find examples, right, of things that you can point to. But there's so many SaaS businesses out there today, and there's so many tools for different parts of the tool chain that cutting through the noise as quickly as possible and getting, feedback on your product as early as possible is probably one of the things I would do again. And eventually I learned, right? Figuring out how you get this into developers' hands. I would actually say the other thing, don't wait to do a great onboarding and activation strategy. Build that into your product in the first step, right? Spend an extra couple weeks in your MVP making a really good onboarding experience. Because even if you do get, product in the hands of folks, developers don't have a lot of time. So you really want to make that onboarding and activation journey good as soon as possible. I had to learn that 3 times.
I think it's such good advice. And I think something that both Tim and I end up coaching a lot of our founders on trying to figure out go to market much earlier. For technical founders, it's not usually something that's
hard.
Very, very hard. I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to talk about Hacktoberfest because it's coming up.
Yeah.
And so what's CodeSee doing for it, and what should folks kind of attend? Is it virtual? Is it in person? How is it actually going to operate?
Yeah, we're very excited. We do Hacktoberfest every year. And like I said before, talking about onboarding, new contributors to your open source project. We've got a much bigger community now this year. It's all virtual, that you can all participate, but it's really nice to feel yes, you can get really awesome swag, right? That's also very good. But you have in our Discord and in the newsletter, you can get your project featured. You can actually converse with other people who are participating in Hacktoberfest, not just in PRs, right? You can really have that support and that real community feel around in a single place for Hacktoberfest. And it will have we'll have events, virtual events, twice a week, I think, for the next 4 weeks. So it's going to be super, super fun. Anna is kind of leading the charge on all of that. And it's going to be just so much fun to be able to take this month and make sure that you can contribute to open source and really contribute to some awesome projects.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end on. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for doing it with us. It's so, so good to see you.
You too. I had so much fun. Thank you for having me on.